The pie had cost Ruth everything she had left. 3 days of rationed flour, the last of her sugar, eggs bartered from a farmer's wife who'd looked at Ruth's threadbare dress with something between pity and contempt. Ruth had mixed and kneaded and baked with hands that trembled from more than just hunger, because this pie, this perfect golden-crusted pie, was supposed to be her ticket to one more week of survival. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had promised, bring something worth eating, and she'd let Ruth stay another 7 days. Maybe longer if the pie was good enough. Maybe long enough for Ruth to find work, to get her feet under her, to finally stop this endless running from town to town like a tumbleweed with a heartbeat. The pie was perfect. Ruth had checked it 3 times that morning, tilting the tin to catch the light, admiring the lattice work she'd woven across the top. Apple and cinnamon. The kind of pie that could make a person remember they were human. She'd wrapped it in her cleanest cloth, which wasn't saying much, and carried it through Salvation Creek like it was made of glass and grace. Past the general store where the clerk had refused to extend her credit. Past the saloon where she'd been turned away from washing dishes because the owner's wife didn't like the look of her. Past the church where the preacher had suggested, with masterful politeness, that Ruth might find a more welcoming congregation in the next town over. Ruth had kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, her steps quick. The usual armor. She was 3 buildings from the boarding house when Jake Hollister stepped into her path. Well, well, his voice carried across the street like he wanted an audience. If it ain't Salvation Creek's favorite charity case. Ruth stopped. She didn't look up. Excuse me. What you got there? Jake moved closer. He smelled like whiskey and leather and the particular cruelty of men who'd never been told no. Smells good. It's nothing. Ruth tried to step around him. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt. Jake was too clever for that kind of obvious violence, but firm enough to stop her cold. Don't be rude now. He smiled. Somewhere behind him, Ruth heard laughter. Men gathering, always men gathering, when Jake Hollister decided to make someone his entertainment. I asked you a question. It's a pie. Ruth's voice came out smaller than she wanted. For Mrs. Henderson. A pie? Jake said it loud, making sure everyone could hear. Our little drifter made a pie. Ain't that sweet? More laughter. Ruth could feel eyes on her from every direction now. The blacksmith's apprentice. 2 cowboys from the Broken J Ranch. Mrs. Chen from the laundry. All of them watching. All of them waiting to see what would happen next. This was how it always went. Ruth had lived this scene in 6 different towns with 6 different names attached to the man playing Jake's role. The script never changed. They'd humiliate her, she'd take it, and then she'd leave before dawn because staying meant worse things than mockery. Please, Ruth said, I need to... You need to what? Jake's grip tightened. You need to go begging to Mrs. Henderson? You need to trade baked goods for a roof because no one in this town wants to hire you? He leaned in close enough that Ruth could see the yellow in his teeth. You ever wonder why that is? Why every town you drift into eventually wants you gone? Ruth didn't answer. There was no answer that would satisfy him. It's because you got that look about you, Jake continued. That used-up, desperate look. Like something that got passed around too many times, and nobody wants to claim. He reached for the pie. Let's see if you can at least bake... Don't. The word came out of Ruth before she could stop it. Jake's eyebrows rose. What did you say? Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct she had screamed at her to apologize, to hand over the pie, to run. But something else stirred in her chest, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. I said don't. Ruth met his eyes. That pie's not yours. The street went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jake's smile spread wider. Well now, looks like the mouse found her squeak. He ripped the pie from her hands. No! Ruth lunged for it. Jake held it high above his head, laughing. The cloth fell away. The other men hooted and jeered, calling out suggestions. Throw it, eat it, make her beg for it back. Please, Ruth hated the sound of her own voice. Please, I need that. You need? Jake lowered the pie just enough to look at it. Tell you what, Ruth, get on your knees and say Jake Hollister is the finest man in Salvation Creek, and maybe I'll give it back. The laughter got louder. Someone whistled. Misses it. Chen turned away, heading back into her laundry, like she couldn't bear to watch. Ruth felt something crack inside her chest. not break. She'd been broken plenty of times. This was different. This was a door she'd kept locked for so long she'd forgotten there was anything behind it. "No," she said. Jake blinked. "What?" "No." Ruth straightened up. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't hide them anymore. "I won't get on my knees. I won't beg. And you're going to give me back my pie." "Or what?" Jake's voice went hard. "Or everyone here is going to see exactly what kind of man you are." Ruth raised her voice, projecting it the way her mother had taught her back when she'd had a mother, back when she'd had a home. "They're going to see that Jake Hollister gets his jollies from tormenting women who can't fight back, that he needs an audience to feel big because alone he ain't nothing but another drunk cowboy who peaked at 17. Someone gasped. The laughter died. Jake's face went red. "You little—" He smashed the pie into the ground. The tin hit the dirt with a sound like a gunshot. The crust shattered. Apples and cinnamon and 3 days of hope splattered across the street in a mess of brown and gold. Ruth stared at it. At the destruction of the only thing between her and starvation. At the death of her last chance in this town. "There's your pie," Jake said. "Now get on your knees and lick it up if you're so hungry." He waited for her to crumble. They all did. Ruth could feel their expectations pressing against her skin, the certainty that she'd cry or run or beg, that she'd do what she always did. Instead, Ruth looked up at Jake Hollister and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who'd just realized she had nothing left to lose and that freedom was the most dangerous thing in the world. "You know what, Jake?" Ruth's voice came out steady, clear. "You're right. I am desperate. I am used up. I have been passed around and passed over and passed by in every town from here to the Oklahoma border." She took a step toward him. "But at least I know what I am. At least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." "Watch your mouth. You want to know why I drift?" Ruth took another step. Jake actually backed up. "It's because of men like you. Men who got to feel powerful by making sure women like me never get our feet under us. Men who are so scared of what we might become if we stopped running that they'll destroy a pie just to keep us hungry." "I ain't scared of you," Jake snarled. "Then why's your hand shaking?" It was. Just barely. But it was. And now everyone could see it. Jake's face went from red to purple. "You got a smart mouth for someone about to be sleeping in the dirt." "I've slept in worse places." Ruth bent down and picked up the pie tin. It was dented but still whole. She wiped the dirt off with her sleeve. "And you know what I learned sleeping in all those ditches and alleys and abandoned shacks?" "What's that?" Ruth looked around at the crowd. At the men who'd laughed. At the women who'd turned away. At the whole town that had been waiting for her to fail. "I learned that it don't matter how many times you knock me down," she said. "I'm going to get back up. Every single time." She turned back to Jake. "So go ahead and feel good about yourself. Go have a drink and tell your friends how you put the drifter in her place. But tomorrow morning, I'll still be here. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. Until this town makes room for me or I make it myself." Jake opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "You're crazy," he finally said. "Maybe." Ruth tucked the empty pie tin under her arm. "But I ain't running anymore." She walked past him, past the crowd, past the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her lips pursed in disapproval. Ruth didn't stop, didn't apologize, didn't explain. She just kept walking. She ended up at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to scrub grass and distant hills. There was a broken water trough there that nobody used anymore. Ruth sat down on its edge and let herself shake. What had she done? The smart play would have been to leave, pack her things, what few things she had, and disappear before Jake decided humiliation wasn't enough, before the whole town turned against her worse than they already had. But Ruth was so tired of running, so tired of being smaller and quieter and less than she was, so tired of surviving when what she really wanted was to live. That was either the bravest thing I've seen or the stupidest. Ruth jumped. She hadn't heard anyone approach. The man standing 10 feet away was tall and weathered, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they wanted to. He wore work clothes worn soft with age and honest dirt under his fingernails. Everything about him said rancher except for the way he stood, balanced and still, like violence was something he knew intimately but didn't reach for first. "I'm betting on stupid," Ruth said. "Seems to be my specialty." The corner of the man's mouth twitched. Might have been a smile on someone who remembered how. "Mason Hale." He didn't offer his hand, just acknowledged his own existence and waited. "Ruth Callahan." She waited too, for judgment, for advice she didn't ask for him to tell her she should apologize to Jake or leave town or learn her place. "You meant it?" Mason asked instead. "What you said to Hollister." "Which part?" "The part about not running." Ruth looked down at the empty pie tin in her lap, at her dirt-stained dress and her worn-through boots and her hands that were still shaking just a little. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have anything else to try. So I guess I either meant it or I'm about to starve to death out of spite. Spite's gotten men through worse. I'm not a man." I noticed. Mason studied her with those old eyes. "You got any experience with cattle?" Ruth blinked. "What? Cattle? Cows? Livestock? You ever worked with them?" Ruth's mind raced. "I've worked farms. Horses, mostly. Some goats. I can ride and I can rope and I can work from sunup to sundown without complaining. Wasn't asking if you could work hard." Mason shifted his weight. "Every drifter says they can work hard. I'm asking if you know cattle." "No," Ruth said, because lying seemed stupid when this man looked like he could spot a falsehood from 100 yards. "But I can learn." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "I'm taking a herd to Fort Collins," he finally said. 600 head, 40 days on the trail. It's rough work. Rougher than anything you've probably done. The crew's all men, and they ain't going to be happy about a woman signing on. You'll get half pay until you prove you can handle it. No special treatment, no excuses, no quitting halfway because it's too hard. Ruth's heart started pounding for a different reason than fear. "If you make it to Fort Collins," Mason continued, "I'll bring you back and you can work the ranch through winter. If you don't make it, you're on your own wherever you end up. Those are the terms." "Why?" Ruth asked. "You don't know me." "No." Mason looked back toward town, toward the street where Jake Hollister was probably still telling everyone how he'd put the drifter in her place. "But I know men like Hollister, and I know it takes grit to stand up to them when you got nothing backing you but your own backbone." He turned back to Ruth. "I got use for grit." Ruth stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, but she locked her knees and met Mason's eyes. "When do we leave?" 3 days? Dawn." Mason started to walk away, then paused. "You got anything you need to do first? Anyone you need to say goodbye to?" Ruth looked down at the empty pie tin, at the last piece of who she'd been, the version of herself that baked and begged and broke. "No," she said. "I'm ready now." Mason nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Bunkhouse is at my ranch, 2 miles north on the main road. You'll see the sign. Tell Henry at the door that you're signed on for the drive. He'll set you up with a bedroll and gear." "I don't have money for—" "It comes out of your pay." Mason was already walking. "And Callahan? Yeah? Don't make me regret this." He left her there with nothing but an empty pie tin and a decision that felt too big for her body to hold. Ruth could still back out, could pack her things and drift to the next town like she always did, could find another boarding house, another temporary job, another few weeks of barely surviving before the cycle started again. Or she could walk 2 miles north and step into something that might kill her. She thought about Jake's face when she'd stood up to him. Thought about the way the laughter had died. Thought about the feeling of her own voice coming out strong and steady and true. Ruth dropped the pie tin in the dirt and started walking north. Tacham. The Hale Ranch looked like it had grown out of the earth itself, all weathered wood and practical construction with no decoration that didn't serve a purpose. The main house sat in the center like a patient elder, surrounded by barns and corrals and sheds that had been added over years of need. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, their bodies like moving shadows against the grass. Ruth found the bunkhouse where Mason said it would be. A thin man with a face like cured leather was sitting on the porch, mending a saddle. "You Henry?" Ruth asked. The man looked up, looked her over, went back to his saddle. Depends on who's asking. Ruth Callahan. Mason Hale sent me. Said I'm signed on for the drive. Henry's hand stopped moving. He looked up again, slower this time. Mason said that. He did. Mason Hale, boss of this ranch, said you, a woman, are signed on for the cattle drive. That's right. Henry set down his saddle, stood up, walked a slow circle around Ruth like she was a horse he was considering buying. You know what a cattle drive is? He asked. I know it's hard work. Hard work. Henry laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Lady, hard work is scrubbing floors. Hard work is hauling water. A cattle drive is 40 days of eating dust, sleeping on rocks, and praying you don't get trampled, drowned, or struck by lightning. It's blisters on top of blisters and going days without a hot meal, and men who ain't bathed in a week all pressed together in close quarters. He leaned in. It ain't no place for a woman. Good thing I ain't a lady then, Ruth said. Henry blinked. I'm a drifter, Ruth continued. I've slept in alleys and barns and under bridges. I've gone 3 days without eating and a week without washing. I've been chased by dogs and men and the law. I've survived things that would make your cattle drive look like a church picnic. She met his eyes. So you can save your warnings. I know what I signed up for. Do you now? I do. Henry studied her face for a long moment. Then he grunted and went back to the porch. Bedrolls inside. Third bunk on the left. You'll need trail clothes. I'll dig up some spares that might fit. Boots look worn, but they'll do if you grease them good. You can ride? Yes. Rope? Well enough. Well enough, don't cut it. You'll practice every day until we leave. Dawn to dusk, you're learning this cruise systems. We do things a specific way, and there ain't time for questions on the trail. Henry picked up his saddle again. You'll take night watch rotation, same as the men. You'll eat after them. You'll do your own mending and washing. You cause problems, you're done. You slow us down, you're done. You complain, you're done. Understood? Understood. And Callahan, yeah? Half the crew's already saying they'll quit if Mason brings a woman. The other half's making bets on how long you'll last. Henry's expression didn't change. My money's on 3 days. Ruth smiled that same dangerous smile she'd given Jake Hollister. Then you're about to lose your money. The next 3 days were harder than anything Ruth had endured in 6 towns of drifting. She woke before dawn and worked past dark, learning the specific rhythms of Mason Hale's operation. The men ignored her when they could and undermined her when they couldn't, offering wrong information or equipment that didn't work just to watch her fail. A cowboy named Tom told her to saddle a horse named Dancer, claiming it was the gentlest mount in the string. Dancer tried to buck Ruth off 3 times before Henry intervened. That horse ain't been broke proper, Henry said, shooting Tom a look that could have curdled milk. You trying to get her killed before we even leave? Tom shrugged. Just testing if she can handle a little spirit. But Ruth could handle it. She'd been handling men's tests her whole life. She learned to rope by practicing on fence posts until her shoulders screamed. Learned the crew's hand signals by watching from the corners and memorizing every gesture. Learned which men would actively sabotage her, which ones would just ignore her, and which ones, like Henry, might give her a fair shake if she proved herself. There was only one of those. Maybe. On the second day, a young cowboy named Samuel caught her behind the barn, struggling to lift a saddle onto a high rack. You're holding it wrong, he said. Ruth tensed, waiting for the mockery. But Samuel just showed her a better grip, helped her get the saddle up, walked away without another word. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in months. By the 3rd day, Ruth's hands were covered in blisters and rope burns. Her back ached from sleeping on a thin bedroll. Her pride was bruised from a dozen small failures and the constant weight of men waiting for her to quit. But she didn't quit. The night before they were set to leave, Ruth sat outside the bunkhouse and tried to repair a tear in her only spare shirt. The needle kept slipping through her torn-up fingers, leaving blood spots on the fabric. You're sewing it backwards. Ruth looked up. A massive man stood in the doorway, had to duck to fit through it. She'd seen him around the ranch, but hadn't learned his name yet. He moved like an avalanche that had learned patience. Backwards how? Ruth asked. The seam. You're pulling it the wrong way. It'll hold for a day, then split worse than before. He held out a hand. I'll show you. Ruth hesitated. Every interaction with these men had been a trap or a test or both. Name's William, the man said, and I ain't offering to help because I like you. I'm offering because watching you ruin that shirt is painful, and we got a long trail ahead. Ruth handed him the shirt. William's fingers were twice the size of hers, but moved with surprising delicacy as he rethreaded the needle and demonstrated the proper technique. His voice was quiet as he explained, patient in a way Ruth hadn't expected. You served before? Ruth asked, noticing the way he held himself. Army, long time ago. William handed back the shirt. You? No, just survived. That's a kind of service, too. He went back inside before Ruth could figure out how to respond to that. She finished the repair the way William had shown her. The stitches held. They left at dawn like Mason had promised. 600 head of cattle, 12 men, 1 woman, 40 days between them and Fort Collins. Ruth had never seen that much livestock in one place. The sound alone was overwhelming, lowing and trampling, and the constant noise of that many living things moving together. The smell hit her like a wall. Manure and hide and dust and grass. Mason sat his horse at the front of the herd, still and sure as a compass point. Henry flanked him on the right. The rest of the crew spread out in practiced positions Ruth had spent 3 days trying to memorize. She'd been assigned drag position, the back of the herd where the dust was thickest and the work was hardest. Exactly where she'd expected to be placed. Samuel caught her eye and nodded once. William was somewhere in the middle of the chaos. Tom made a point of riding past her with a smirk that said everything about how long he thought she'd last. Callahan! Henry's voice cut through the noise. You ready? Ruth thought about the pie in the dirt, about Jake Hollister's face, about 6 towns that had spit her out like spoiled meat. She thought about the empty pie tin she'd left behind and the person she'd decided to stop being. Ready, she called back. The drive started moving. For the first hour, it was manageable. Ruth kept the stragglers moving, stayed out of the way of the more experienced riders, and tried not to breathe too much dust. By the second hour, her eyes were watering and her throat was raw and every muscle in her body was screaming. By the third hour, she understood why Henry had bet against her. This wasn't hard work. This was something beyond hard, a test of whether a person's will could outlast their body's very reasonable desire to quit. A calf broke from the herd, panicked and running. Ruth wheeled her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess that had been deemed too slow for the men, and went after it. The calf was fast and stupid with fear, heading straight for a wash that would break its legs if it fell. Ruth pushed Bess harder, got ahead of the calf, cut it off, and turned it back toward the herd. When she returned, Tom was waiting. Lucky catch, he said. Wasn't luck. Sure it wasn't. Tom spat tobacco juice that nearly hit Ruth's boot. Just wait until something actually goes wrong. Then we'll see what you're made of. He rode off before Ruth could respond. But she knew he was right. Catching one calf didn't prove anything. And these men were waiting, actively hoping for her to fail in a way they could all witness. Ruth settled back into drag position and breathed dust and told herself she just had to last 1 day. Then another. Then another. 40 days. She could do anything for 40 days. The first real test came on day 4. They'd made decent progress despite the heat and a river crossing that had taken half a day of careful work. The crew was tired but satisfied. Even Tom had stopped making comments about Ruth, though whether that was acceptance or just exhaustion, she couldn't tell. They'd set up camp in a valley with good grass and a creek for water. The cattle were settled. Dinner was cooking. Men were sprawled around the fire, too exhausted to do more than eat and sleep. Ruth was on first watch, her and a cowboy named Pete, who hadn't spoken to her once in 4 days. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made Ruth grateful for the threadbare blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders. She circled the herd slowly, watching for signs of restlessness, listening for anything that didn't belong. That's when she heard it. A sound like cloth ripping, then a man's voice cutting through the dark, high and sharp with pain. Ruth kicked Bess into a run toward the noise. She found Pete on the ground near the supply wagon, clutching his right hand against his chest. Even in the moonlight, Ruth could see the blood. What happened? Ruth hit the ground running. Knife slipped. Pete's voice was tight. Was cutting rope and it... He sucked in air through his teeth. It's bad. It was worse than bad. The knife had laid Pete's palm open from heel to fingertips, a deep gash that was bleeding too fast and too dark. In the firelight from camp, Ruth could see white, bone or tendon. She wasn't sure. Don't move! Ruth pulled off her bandana and wrapped it around Pete's hand, applying pressure. Someone get Mason! Men came running. Mason appeared with a lantern, Henry right behind him. How bad? Mason asked. Ruth pulled back the bandana. Blood welled up immediately. Henry whistled low. That needs a doctor. Nearest doctor's 2 days back, Tom said. He'd appeared in the crowd. We'd have to send someone. Can't spare anyone, Mason said. And Pete can't wait 2 days. The men looked at each other. Pete's face had gone gray. I can stitch it, Ruth heard herself say. Every head turned toward her. You can what? Tom asked. Stitch it. I've done it before. Ruth kept pressure on Pete's hand. Had a friend who worked on a ranch. She taught me how to close cuts on livestock. This ain't that different. It's his hand, someone said. You mess it up, he could lose use of it. And if we don't do anything, he could lose the whole hand to infection, Ruth shot back. She looked at Mason. I can do it, but it's got to be now. Mason studied her face in the lamplight, searching for doubt or deception or incompetence. Whatever he saw must have been enough. Do it, he said. Henry brought the medical kit. Ruth sent someone to boil water and clean the needle. She had Pete moved closer to the fire where the light was better, and the warmth might keep him from going into shock. This is going to hurt, Ruth told him. I can't offer you anything for the pain except whiskey and something to bite down on. Pete nodded. His jaw was clenched so hard Ruth worried about his teeth. William appeared with a leather strap. Use this. Pete bit down on it. Ruth threaded the needle with hands that had steadied somewhere between panic and action. She'd done this before. Sewn up a horse's flank after barbed wire, stitched a goat's ear back on after a dog attack. But those had been animals. This was a man's hand, his livelihood. If she failed, Pete would never work cattle again. Ruth took a breath. Let it out. Began. The first stitch made Pete scream around the leather strap. The second made him pass out, which was probably a mercy. Ruth kept working, closing the wound in small, careful stitches that Henry held the lantern steady for, and William made sure Pete didn't thrash. It took 20 minutes that felt like hours. When Ruth tied off the final stitch, her hands were shaking and Pete was still unconscious, and every man in camp was watching her like she'd just performed surgery by moonlight, which she supposed she had. It's done, Ruth said. Keep it clean. Change the bandages twice a day. If it gets red or swollen or starts to smell bad, we'll have to cauterize it. Mason looked at the stitches, at Pete's pale face, at Ruth's bloody hands. You done this a lot? He asked. Enough, Ruth said. On people? No, but flesh is flesh. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Henry, set up a rotation to watch him. Make sure he drinks water when he wakes up. He looked at Ruth. Good work. It wasn't praise exactly, but coming from Mason Hale, it felt like a parade. The men dispersed slowly. Tom lingered, staring at Pete's bandaged hand like he was trying to find fault with Ruth's work, and couldn't. Samuel caught Ruth's arm as she went to wash the blood off her hands. That was something, he said quietly. It was necessary. Still, Samuel met her eyes. Most of us wouldn't have known what to do. You saved his hand, maybe his life. Ruth didn't know what to say to that. She went to the creek and scrubbed the blood from her skin in water so cold it burned. When she came back, Pete was awake and drinking water and looking at his bandaged hand like he couldn't quite believe it was still attached. He looked up when Ruth approached. Thank you, he said. It was the first thing he'd said to her since the drive started. Don't thank me yet, Ruth told him. Thank me when it heals without infection. But she could see it in his eyes, the shift from dismissal to respect. From seeing her as a burden to seeing her as crew. 1 man down, 11 to go. Ruth settled back into her bedroll and tried to sleep. Tomorrow they'd move again. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, new chances to fail. But tonight she'd saved a man's hand. Tonight she'd proven she belonged here. And that was enough. Pete's hand didn't get infected, which made Ruth more relieved than she wanted to admit. Every morning she changed his bandages while the rest of the crew broke camp, and every morning she checked for the telltale signs of rot: heat, redness, the smell of flesh going bad. But the stitches held and the wound stayed clean, and by day 8, Pete could flex his fingers without crying out. "Reckon I owe you more than thanks," he said one morning while Ruth was rewrapping the gauze. The sun was barely up and the rest of the camp was still waking, groggy men stumbling toward coffee and the prospect of another brutal day. "You don't owe me anything," Ruth said, keeping her eyes on her work. "I told the others I wouldn't talk to you, that I wouldn't help you or acknowledge you or make this easier." Pete's voice was quiet. "Tom said if we froze you out long enough, you'd quit on your own." Ruth's hands paused for just a second. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I was wrong." Pete looked at his hand, at the neat line of stitches that had probably saved his ability to earn a living. "And because you got a right to know what you're up against." Ruth finished tying off the bandage. "I already knew." "Maybe, but now you know I ain't part of it anymore." Pete stood, testing his grip on the reins of an imaginary horse. "For what it's worth." He walked away before Ruth could figure out what to say. She watched him go, this man who'd spent a week pretending she didn't exist and was now offering something that might have been an apology, or might have been a warning, or might have been both. 2 men now. William, who'd shown her how to sew. Samuel, who'd helped with the saddle. Pete, who'd seen her save his hand and decided she was worth talking to. Out of 12, that still left 9 who wanted her gone. The morning unfolded like all the others. Controlled chaos as the crew got 600 head of cattle moving north. Ruth took her position at drag, breathing dust and keeping the stragglers in line. Her body had started to adapt to the work. The blisters had hardened into calluses. Her muscles still ached, but it was a dull throb now instead of sharp agony. She could stay in the saddle for 10 hours without wanting to die. Progress, she figured. Small and hard-won, but progress. Around midday, Henry rode back to check on her. He did this once a day, appearing out of the dust like a ghost made of leather and disappointment. "How's the pace?" he asked. "Fine." "Cattle giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." Henry looked at her with those hard eyes that never seemed to blink. "You're still here." "That surprise you?" "Everything about you surprises me." He shifted in his saddle. "Most women would have quit by now. Hell, most men would have quit by now." "I'm not most people." "No." Henry almost smiled. "No, you ain't." He wheeled his horse around. "Keep it up, Callahan. You're doing better than I bet you would." He rode off before Ruth could ask what exactly he'd bet. But the fact that he'd acknowledged her work at all felt like winning something she didn't know was a prize. That afternoon they hit rough terrain, a series of rocky hills that forced the herd to string out single file through narrow passes. It was dangerous work. One spooked cow could cause a stampede. One thrown horse could leave a man trampled. Ruth kept Bess steady and her rope ready and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. They were halfway through when a calf lost its footing on loose shale and went down hard. Its mother immediately panicked, bawling and trying to turn back against the flow of cattle. The whole herd started to ripple with unease. "Someone get that calf!" Mason's voice carried over the noise. Ruth was already moving. She pushed Bess through the press of cattle toward the downed calf. It was on its side, one leg bent wrong, and its eyes rolling white with fear. Its mother was blocking the path, lowering her horns at anyone who came close. "Easy," Ruth said to both animals and herself. She dropped from the saddle and approached on foot. Stupid dangerous, but there was no room to rope from horseback. The mother cow bellowed a warning. The calf tried to stand and fell again. Ruth kept moving, slow and steady, hands out where the mother could see them. Years of working with scared animals had taught her that panic was contagious, and calm was too, if you could project enough of it. "I'm just going to help your baby," Ruth said, keeping her voice low and even. "Just going to check that leg. Then we'll get you both moving again." The mother cow stamped but didn't charge. Ruth got close enough to kneel beside the calf. Its leg wasn't broken, just twisted in a way that made standing impossible. Ruth straightened it gently while the calf thrashed, and its mother made sounds that were going to bring the whole herd down on them if Ruth didn't hurry. There. Ruth helped the calf to its feet. It stood shakily, but it stood. Go on now. Get moving. The calf stumbled toward its mother. The mother touched its nose and turned back into the flow of cattle. Crisis averted. Ruth swung back into the saddle and found Tom watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You could have been killed, he said. But I wasn't. Luck again? Skill. Ruth met his eyes. You want to keep pretending everything I do right is an accident, go ahead. But we both know better. She rode past him before he could respond. Her hands were shaking, delayed fear catching up with adrenaline, but she kept them steady on the reins where no one could see. That night around the fire, William handed her an extra portion of beans without a word. Samuel made room for her to sit. Pete asked her to check his hand even though the bandage didn't need changing. The others still kept their distance. But the wall of silence was developing cracks. By day 12, Ruth had fallen into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, check Pete's hand, saddle Bess, move cattle until dark, eat whatever was cooking, sleep like the dead. Her body hurt less. Her hands no longer bled. She could rope a steer from 30 feet and hit the target 7 times out of 10. The landscape had changed too. The flat prairie was giving way to rolling hills and scattered trees. The air smelled different, less dust, more pine. They were making good time, Mason said. If the weather held, they'd reach Fort Collins ahead of schedule. But the weather didn't hold. The storm came out of nowhere on day 14, a wall of black clouds that swallowed the western horizon in the space of an hour. Mason called an early halt and had the crew set up camp in the lee of a small canyon that might offer some protection. Tie everything down, Henry ordered. And I mean everything. If it ain't secured, it's gone. The men scrambled to follow orders. Ruth helped secure the supply wagon, roping down tarps and boxes and anything that could blow away. The wind was already picking up, throwing dust and small rocks that stung like hornets. This is going to be bad, Samuel said. He was tying down his bedroll with quick, practiced movements. I've seen storms like this. They don't just pass. They dig in and make you suffer. He was right. The storm hit at sunset with the force of a physical blow. Rain fell in sheets so thick Ruth couldn't see 10 feet in front of her face. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars. Thunder shook the ground hard enough to feel in her chest. The cattle were panicking. Ruth could hear them over the storm, 600 animals terrified and trying to scatter in 600 different directions. The crew was out in it, trying to keep the herd together through sheer force of will and years of experience. Ruth saddled Bess and rode into the chaos. It was like riding through a nightmare. Rain so cold it hurt. Wind that tried to pull her from the saddle. Lightning close enough to smell the ozone. And everywhere, cattle running blind with fear. Push them toward the canyon, Mason's voice barely carried over the storm. Don't let them scatter. Ruth pushed, so did the others. For hours they fought the storm and the herd and their own exhaustion. Ruth's clothes were soaked through. Her teeth were chattering. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel the reins. But she kept riding. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, a steer broke from the herd and ran straight for the edge of the canyon. Ruth wheeled Bess and gave chase. The ground was mud now, slick and treacherous. One wrong step would send them both tumbling. The steer reached the edge and stopped, confused by the sudden drop. Ruth got her rope ready. One chance. If she missed, the steer would either fall or bolt and take others with it. She threw. The loop settled around the steer's horns like it was meant to be there. Ruth dallied the rope around her saddle horn, and Bess leaned back, stopping the steer's momentum. For a second, everything balanced. Ruth and Bess on one side, the panicked steer on the other, physics deciding which way it would go. Then Bess took a step back, then another. The steer came away from the edge and Ruth turned it back toward the herd. When she returned, Tom was there again. Always Tom, watching her with those calculating eyes. Nice throw, he said. It was the first compliment he'd given her. Ruth was too tired to enjoy it. Thanks. The storm lasted until midnight. By the time it passed, the crew was dead on their feet and the cattle were scattered across a mile of canyon and hillside. They'd lost count of how many, maybe a dozen, maybe more. We'll find them at first light, Mason said. His voice was hoarse from shouting orders through the storm. Everyone get some sleep. Sleep seemed impossible. Ruth was wet and cold and so tired she could barely dismount. But she found her bedroll, damp but not soaked, thank mercies, and collapsed into it. She woke to Pete shaking her shoulder. Ruth, Ruth, wake up. She opened her eyes to gray dawn light and Pete's worried face. What's wrong? It's Tom. He went out at first light to look for strays and his horse came back without him. Ruth was on her feet before her brain fully processed the words. Where? North side of the canyon. Mason's organizing search parties. Pete handed her a canteen. Drink something first. You look like hell. Ruth drank. The water was cold and tasted like metal, but it woke her up enough to think. Tom was missing. Tom, who'd spent 2 weeks trying to freeze her out and betting she'd fail. Tom, who was still crew even if he was a bastard. I'll search the East Ridge, Ruth said. Mason assigned you to I know what Mason assigned me to. I'm searching the East Ridge. Ruth was already moving toward Bess. Her whole body ached from yesterday's storm, but that didn't matter. A man was missing. Pete didn't argue. Ruth rode out alone, scanning the muddy ground for tracks or signs of struggle. The storm had washed away most of the evidence, but she'd learned to track during her years of drifting, following animal trails to water, reading the land for safe places to sleep. She found Tom's horse first, grazing calmly in a small valley like nothing was wrong. Then she found Tom's hat, caught on a bush. Then she found Tom. He was wedged between 2 rocks at the bottom of a wash, conscious but trapped. His left leg was bent at an angle that made Ruth's stomach turn. Well, Tom said when he saw her. His face was gray with pain. Ain't this perfect? Course it'd be you who finds me. Ruth dismounted and climbed down to him. The rocks were slick with mud and rain runoff. One wrong move would send her sliding into Tom or past him entirely. How bad's the leg? She asked. Bad enough that I can't walk. Not bad enough that I'm dying, if that's what you're hoping. I'm not hoping you're dying, you idiot. Ruth examined the rocks pinning him. They were big, too big for her to move alone. I need to get help. No. Tom's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Don't leave me here. The fear in his voice was raw and real and so unexpected that Ruth stopped. I have to get help, she said more gently. I can't move these rocks by myself. What if you don't come back? What if you leave me here and tell them you couldn't find me? Tom's eyes were wide. What if this is payback for how I treated you? Ruth looked at this man who'd made her life miserable for 2 weeks, who'd undermined her and mocked her and bet against her at every turn, who was now terrified that she'd do to him what he'd done to her, abandon him when he needed help most. She could walk away, ride back to camp and say she'd searched but found nothing. Let Tom suffer a little longer before someone else found him. Let him feel what it was like to be discarded. Instead, Ruth squeezed his hand. I'm coming back, she said. I'm going to get William and Samuel and we're going to get you out of here. And Tom, when we do, you're going to owe me. Not just thanks, real debt, the kind that changes how you treat people. Tom nodded. He looked like he might cry. Ruth climbed out of the wash and rode for camp like her life depended on it. She found William first, then Samuel, then Mason. Within minutes, they were all riding back, 6 men, including Henry, who'd insisted on coming despite his age. They got Tom out. It took ropes and leverage and William's massive strength, but they freed him from the rocks and got him onto a makeshift stretcher. His leg was broken in 2 places. He'd need a splint and weeks of rest and probably wouldn't work cattle again this season. But he was alive. As they carried him back to camp, Tom caught Ruth's eye. You came back, he said. I said I would. Yeah. Tom looked away. You did. That night, while Ruth was setting Tom's leg, she seemed to be the crew's unofficial doctor now, he spoke again. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. The other men had given them space, though Ruth suspected they were all listening. I thought you'd be weak, thought you'd slow us down or cause problems, or need special treatment. I thought... He stopped, started again. I thought you being here meant you thought you were better than us, that you were trying to prove something. Ruth pulled the splint tight. Tom hissed through his teeth but didn't complain. I wasn't trying to prove anything, Ruth said. I was just trying to survive. I know that now. Tom met her eyes. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For all of it. The pie thing back in town, I heard about that. Thought it was funny at the time. I don't anymore. Ruth tied off the last bandage. You weren't the one who smashed the pie. No, but I would have laughed if I'd been there. Same thing, ain't it? Was it? Ruth didn't know anymore. She was too tired to parse the degrees of cruelty. Just don't do it again, she said. Won't. Tom lay back. And Ruth? Thank you for coming back, for not... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Word spread fast. By morning, every man on the crew knew that Ruth had found Tom, that she'd refused to leave him, that she'd organized his rescue and set his broken leg. And more importantly, they knew that Tom had apologized to her. If Pete saving his hand had earned her respect from 3 men, saving Tom's life earned it from the rest. The dynamic shifted overnight. Suddenly, there was space for her at the fire. Suddenly, men were asking her opinion on which route to take or how to handle a difficult cow. Suddenly, she wasn't fighting for every inch of acceptance. Henry noticed. He rode up to Ruth on day 16 and studied her with those evaluating eyes. You're managing the impossible, he said. What's that? Getting cowboys to admit they were wrong. He almost smiled. That don't happen often. Maybe they just needed a reason to change their minds. Maybe. Or maybe you're tougher than any of us gave you credit for. Henry tipped his hat. Keep it up, Callahan. We might make a drover out of you yet. The days blurred together after that. The work was still brutal. Long hours in the saddle, short nights on hard ground, meals that were more sustenance than food. But it was different now. Ruth was part of the crew instead of fighting to be tolerated by it. She learned their rhythms and routines. Learned that William had been a soldier who'd seen things he didn't talk about. Learned that Samuel was saving money to buy his own land someday. Learned that Pete had 3 daughters back home, and Tom had a wife who was pregnant with their first child. They became real to her, not obstacles or enemies, but people. And she became real to them. On day 20, they hit another crisis. The river they'd planned to cross had swollen with storm runoff, turned from a manageable ford into a churning brown torrent that looked capable of swallowing the whole herd. Mason surveyed it from horseback, his expression grim. We can't cross here, Henry said. We can't go around. That'll add a week to the drive. Mason looked upstream, downstream, back at the herd. We're low on supplies as it is. The crew gathered to discuss options. They could wait and hope the water went down, but that might take days. They could backtrack to a different crossing, but that meant losing time and pushing cattle over terrain they'd already covered. They could try to force the crossing, but that was asking for cattle to drown and men to die. Ruth listened to the debate and thought about the landscape they'd passed through that morning. There'd been a series of small hills about 2 miles back, and beyond them. There's another crossing, she said. The men stopped talking and looked at her. Where? Mason asked. 2 miles upstream. I saw it this morning when I was scouting for strays. The river splits around an island. Both channels looked shallow enough to ford. Henry frowned. You sure about that? Sure enough to check it out before we commit to this crossing. Mason considered, then nodded. Henry, take Ruth and Samuel. Scout it out. If it's passable, we'll move the herd. They rode upstream. Ruth's memory proved accurate. The river did split, and both channels were significantly shallower than the main flow. They tested the depth and the current and the footing. This'll work, Henry said. He looked at Ruth with something that might have been respect or might have been surprise. Good eye, Callahan. They brought the herd across that evening. It was still difficult work. 600 cattle didn't move through water easily, but it was possible. They didn't lose a single head. That night, Mason came to find Ruth while she was cleaning her gear. You saved us a week, he said. Just noticed something. Most people wouldn't have noticed, or if they did, they wouldn't have spoken up. Mason sat down on a rock nearby. You settling in? Ruth thought about Pete's hand and Tom's leg, and the river crossing, and the 2 weeks of being frozen out before the crew decided she was worth keeping. Getting there, she said. Good. Mason was quiet for a moment. You know why I hired you? You said you needed grit. I did need grit, but I also needed someone who'd been beaten down and was still standing. Someone who knew what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. He looked at her. This ranch has been bleeding money for 3 years. Drought, disease, cattle prices in the dirt. I'm one bad season away from losing everything my father built. Ruth stopped cleaning her saddle. Why are you telling me this? Because I see something in you that I need on my crew, not just for this drive, but permanent. Someone who fights when there's no good reason to keep fighting. Someone who saves lives and solves problems and doesn't quit when things get hard. Mason stood. You make it to Fort Collins, the job's yours. Full pay, permanent position. But I need to know you're in it for the long run, not just running away from the last town that kicked you out. It was the most Mason had said to her since the drive started. Ruth felt the weight of it, the offer and the question underneath. Was she running to something or just away from everything? I don't know how to be anything but a drifter, Ruth admitted. Then learn. Mason started to walk away, then paused. You're already halfway there, you just don't see it yet. He left her with that thought and a job offer that felt too big to hold. Ruth went back to cleaning her gear. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced. A permanent position. Real work, real pay, a place to stay through winter. Everything she'd been chasing for 6 towns and 6 failures. All she had to do was finish this drive. 20 more days, 40 days total. She could do that. Couldn't she? The next morning brought new challenges. Always new challenges. A broken wagon wheel that took hours to repair. A spooked horse that threw its rider, thankfully not seriously. Supplies running lower than expected because the storm had ruined some of their flour. They rationed, cut portions. Made do. On day 23, they ran out of coffee. This should not have been a crisis, but to men who'd been running on caffeine and stubbornness for 3 weeks, it was devastating. I can't do this without coffee, one of the cowboys moaned. You can and you will, Henry said. But even he looked pained. Ruth thought about the plants she'd learned to identify during her drifting years, the roots and leaves and bark you could use when you had nothing else. I might be able to help, she said. An hour later, she was boiling chicory root and dried dandelion in a pot over the fire. It wasn't coffee, but it was hot and bitter and caffeinated enough to keep men from murdering each other. This tastes like dirt, Tom said. Then don't drink it. He drank it anyway. So did everyone else. By day 25, they'd settled into a new normal. Ruth was no longer the woman they were testing. She was crew. When William's horse went lame, Ruth helped him redistribute his gear. When Samuel got sick from bad water, Ruth made him willow bark tea and bullied him into resting. When Henry needed someone to scout ahead, he sent Ruth without hesitation. She belonged here. The realization hit her one evening while she was brushing down Bess. She belonged. Not because she'd proven herself worthy or because she'd earned enough points or jumped through enough hoops, but because she'd simply stayed when everything in her screamed to run, and in staying, she'd become part of something bigger than survival. You look happy, Samuel said. He was nearby, mending a bridle. Do I? Yeah. First time since we started. He threaded his needle. It suits you. Ruth thought about that. Thought about happiness being something that could suit a person like a well-fitted coat. Thanks, she said. They rode on. The drought started so gradually that Ruth didn't notice it at first. Day 27 brought clear skies and warm sun, which seemed like a blessing after the storms. Day 28 was the same. By day 29, the creeks they'd been counting on for water were running shallow and the grass was looking brittle. By day 30, the land looked like it was dying. This ain't normal, Sue, Henry said, staring at a creek bed that should have been running but was barely trickling. We're 2 weeks early for this kind of dry spell. Mason knelt and pressed his hand into the dirt. It crumbled like ash. We need to pick up the pace. Get to the next water source before it dries up completely. The cattle are already exhausted, William said. Push them harder and we'll lose more than we gain. Don't push them and they die of thirst. Mason stood, dusting off his hands. We move faster. No choice. They pushed the herd harder. The cattle protested with every step, their lowing taking on a desperate edge. The crew was running on fumes too, short on water, shorter on sleep, surviving on jerky and hardtack and the knowledge that Fort Collins was close enough to taste if you squinted right. Ruth's lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt like leather. Bess was holding up better than some of the other horses, but even she was flagging. Every living thing for miles was focused on the same question: where's the water? On day 31, they found a small spring that was still running. The cattle stampeded toward it, and the crew barely managed to keep them from trampling each other in their desperation. They let the animals drink first, then refilled every canteen and vessel they had. "This'll get us to the Clearwater River," Mason said, studying his worn map. 2 days north. After that, it's easy terrain to Fort Collins. "If the Clearwater's still running," Tom said. His broken leg was splinted and healing, but he couldn't ride, so he'd been relegated to driving the supply wagon. The inactivity was making him irritable. "It'll be running. It's fed by mountain snowmelt. Doesn't dry up." But Mason's voice carried doubt he was trying to hide. They rationed the water carefully, 2 cups per person per day, 1 for the horses. The cattle would have to wait until they reached the river. Ruth had survived on less. During her worst weeks of drifting, she'd gone 3 days with nothing but what she could catch in her mouth during rain. But that had been just her. Now she was responsible for keeping 600 head of cattle alive, and the weight of that responsibility pressed against her ribs like a hand. The landscape changed as they pushed north. The grass gave way to rocky scrubland dotted with stunted trees that looked like they were barely clinging to life. The sun beat down without mercy. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. On day 32, one of the older steers collapsed and didn't get up. They had to leave it behind. By evening, 3 more had fallen. Mason's jaw was tight as he made the decision to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to lose time burying cattle or waiting for stragglers. The crew was fracturing under the pressure. Small arguments erupted over nothing: whose turn it was for watch, who'd taken the last of the jerky, whether they should have rationed the water differently. Ruth stayed quiet and kept working, but she could feel the tension building like static before a storm. That night, Samuel approached her while she was checking on Bess. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Fine." "You're a terrible liar." He leaned against the makeshift corral they'd rigged. "We all are, really, pretending we're not scared." Ruth looked at him. At this young man who'd been kind to her from nearly the beginning, who'd shown her grace when the others were still deciding if she was worth their time. "What are you scared of?" she asked. "Dying out here. Not making it back to see my family." Samuel kicked at the dirt. "Sounds stupid when I say it out loud." "It's not stupid." "Yeah, well, thanks for saying so." He was quiet for a moment. "You ever think about just walking away? Like, we could take a horse and some water and just ride south until we found civilization?" Ruth had thought about it. In her darkest moments, when the thirst was worst and her body was screaming for rest, the thought had crossed her mind like a snake in tall grass. "Every day," she admitted. "But you don't do it." "No." "Why not?" Ruth thought about Mason's offer, about the crew that had slowly become something like family, about the person she was becoming out here in the dust and heat and endless struggle. "Because running away is what I've always done," she said, "and I'm tired of it." Samuel nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe they all understood that staying was the harder choice, and that's why it mattered. Day 33 dawned hotter than any before it. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Ruth noticed the cattle were restless, shifting and lowing in patterns that set her teeth on edge. "Something's coming," William said. He was scanning the western horizon with a hand shading his eyes. "Storm?" Pete asked hopefully. "Wrong kind of clouds." Ruth looked where William was pointing. The sky to the west had turned a strange orange-brown color, like rust spreading across metal. It didn't look like any storm she'd ever seen. Mason saw it too. She watched his face go from concern to grim to something close to afraid in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Everyone mount up," he said quietly. "What is it?" Henry asked. "Fire." The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. For a second, nobody moved. Then everyone moved at once. Ruth had seen prairie fires before, distant orange glows on the horizon that you watched and hoped would turn away. But she'd never been close to one. Never had to outrun one. How far? She asked, swinging into her saddle. Can't tell yet. Could be 10 miles. Could be 5. Mason was already organizing the crew. We're going to push for the river, fast as we can without killing the cattle. If the fire catches us before we reach water, we're going to have to make a stand. Make a stand how? Tom asked from the wagon. Backburn. Create our own fire line and hope like hell it works. They started moving. Not the careful, controlled drive they'd maintained for 33 days, but something closer to a stampede that they were trying to direct. The cattle could smell the smoke now. Ruth could smell it too, acrid and wrong. They were panicking, wanting to run, and it took everything the crew had to keep them pointed north toward the river. The smoke thickened as they rode. The sun disappeared behind a haze that turned the world sepia-toned and surreal. Ruth tied a bandana over her nose and mouth, but it didn't help much. Every breath tasted like burning. "How much farther to the river?" she shouted to Henry. 5 miles, maybe 6. Behind them, the horizon had turned from orange to red. Ruth could see flames now, a wall of them eating across the prairie faster than seemed possible. The wind had picked up, pushing the fire toward them like a hunter driving prey. They weren't going to make it to the river. The math was simple and brutal. The fire was moving faster than the cattle could run. Mason knew it too. Ruth could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins too tight. "We're going to have to burn," he announced. "Ruth, Samuel, William, with me. Everyone else keep the herd moving. Don't stop for anything." "What are you doing?" Henry demanded. "Buying time." Mason was already dismounting near a section of dry grass. "We set a backburn here, create a black line the main fire can't cross. The herd passes through the burned section and keeps going to the river." "That's insane," Tom said. "You'll be caught between 2 fires." "Only if we're slow." Mason looked at Ruth. "You coming?" It wasn't really a question. Ruth dismounted and grabbed the torch Henry was already lighting from the fire kit they carried. The plan was simple in theory: set a controlled fire that would burn toward the main blaze, consuming all the fuel in a strip of land about 100 yards wide. The main fire would reach the burned ground and have nothing left to feed on, forcing it to go around or die out. The herd would cross the burned section where there was nothing left to ignite. In practice, it meant standing in the path of an inferno and betting their lives they could control the chaos. Ruth touched her torch to the dry grass. It caught immediately, flames racing away from her faster than she could run. Samuel was doing the same 20 feet to her left. William was farther down. Mason was coordinating, making sure the burn line was even and wide enough. The heat was incredible. Ruth's face felt like it was blistering. The smoke was so thick she could barely see. Her eyes were streaming and her lungs were screaming, and some distant part of her brain was asking what kind of person runs toward a fire instead of away from it. "The kind who's tired of running," she answered herself. "That's enough!" Mason's voice cut through the roar of flames. "Mount up!" They ran for their horses. Ruth's hands were shaking so hard she could barely grab the reins. Bess was wild-eyed with fear, but stood steady long enough for Ruth to get into the saddle. The backburn was working. Sort of. The strip of land they torched was burning fast, creating the black line they needed. But the main fire was coming up behind it faster than expected, and the wind was doing unpredictable things with the flames. "Go!" Mason shouted. They rode through their own fire. Ruth had never experienced anything like it. The heat, the smoke, the sound of flames consuming everything around her. Bess jumped a line of fire that cut across their path. Ruth held on with everything she had and prayed to anyone listening that the horse wouldn't stumble. They burst out the other side into air that was merely terrible instead of unsurvivable. The herd was ahead of them, still moving toward the river. The crew had kept them going despite everything. Ruth looked back. The backburn had created a gap in the fuel, and the main fire was slowing where it hit the scorched earth. But it wasn't stopping. The flames were finding ways around, jumping the burned section in places where the wind carried embers across. "It's not enough," Samuel said. His face was black with soot. "It bought us time," Mason replied. "Keep moving." They pushed the cattle harder. The animals were beyond exhausted, running on pure instinct and terror. Several more collapsed and had to be abandoned. Ruth tried not to think about them burning alive behind her. The river appeared like a mirage, a silver ribbon cutting through the brown landscape. The cattle saw it too and found energy they shouldn't have had, surging toward the water in a chaotic mass that the crew had given up trying to control. "Let them run," Mason called. "Just make sure they don't trample each other at the bank." The herd hit the water in a wave. Cattle plunged in up to their shoulders, drinking and cooling themselves and making sounds that might have been relief if cows could feel such things. The crew followed, pushing horses into the river until everyone and everything was soaked and gasping. Ruth slid off Bess's back into water that felt like salvation. She dunked her head under, washing away soot and smoke and the certainty that she was about to die. When she came up, she saw the fire had reached the opposite bank of the river, but it couldn't cross. Water was the one thing fire couldn't consume. They'd made it. "Everyone here?" Mason was counting heads, counting cattle, trying to assess their losses. "We're here," Henry confirmed. "Lost maybe 40 head. Could have been worse." "Could have been everyone," William said quietly. They stayed in the river until the fire burned itself out against the water's edge. Then they climbed out onto the north bank, tired, scorched, alive, and tried to figure out what came next. Tom's wagon had made it across. Most of their supplies were intact, though some had been damaged by smoke or heat. They had water now, at least. The river was running strong, fed by snowmelt like Mason had promised. But they'd lost cattle, lost time, lost the easy confidence that had carried them through the first 30 days. Ruth sat on the riverbank and examined her hands. They were blistered from the torches, cut from rope work, permanently stained with dirt and work. They looked like a stranger's hands, like someone who did hard things and survived them. "You all right?" Mason appeared beside her. Define all right. He almost smiled. "Fair point." He sat down, groaning slightly. The man had to be 50 at least, and he'd just run through fire like he was 20. "You did good back there, with the back burn. We almost died." "Almost only counts in horseshoes." Mason stretched out his legs. "But we didn't die. We made it. And that's because everyone did their part, including you." Ruth looked at the fire still smoldering on the opposite bank, at the black scar it had left across the prairie, at the cattle scattered along the riverbank, exhausted but alive. "How much farther to Fort Collins?" she asked. 3 days if we push, 4 if we take it easy." "What are we going to do?" "Take it easy," Mason said. "These cattle need rest. We need rest. We'll camp here tonight, assess our losses tomorrow, and move out the day after." He stood up, joints popping. "You should get some sleep, Callahan. You look like you've been through hell." "I have been." "Then you've earned the rest." He walked away, leaving Ruth alone with her thoughts, and the sound of the river, and the knowledge that she'd stood between death and survival, and somehow chosen right. That night, the crew gathered around a fire that seemed cruel after what they'd just survived. But they needed the warmth as the temperature dropped, needed the light to keep the darkness at bay. Nobody talked much. They were too tired, too wrung out from fear and exertion. Ruth sat between Samuel and Pete, sharing a blanket because most of theirs had been lost or damaged. "You think it's always like this?" Pete asked quietly. "Cattle driving?" "No," Henry said from across the fire. "Most drives are just boring, long stretches of nothing punctuated by brief moments of terror. This one's been—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Cursed," Tom supplied. "I was going to say educational." "Same thing." Despite everything, Ruth smiled. These men had been through fire, literal fire, and they could still find humor in the ashes. There was something unbreakable in that. "We're going to make it," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Yeah," Samuel agreed. "We are." They slept badly that night, waking at every sound and smell that might signal danger. But morning came peaceful and clear, the smoke finally dissipated and the sky returning to its normal blue. Mason's count showed they'd lost 37 head in the fire. Not as bad as it could have been, but enough to hurt. The surviving cattle were in rough shape, singed, exhausted, skittish. Several had injuries that would need tending. Ruth spent the morning treating burns and cuts, using what remained of their medical supplies. Her hands worked automatically while her mind was elsewhere, processing everything that had happened. The drought, the fire, the backburn, the river. She'd made choices back there. Split-second decisions between bad options and worse ones, And somehow she'd chosen right. Somehow they'd all survived. "You're thinking too hard," William said. He was nearby, reshaping a horseshoe that had come loose during the chaos. "How can you tell?" "You get this look, like you're trying to solve a problem that ain't got a solution." Ruth smiled despite herself. "Maybe I am. Want some advice?" "Do I have a choice?" William hammered the horseshoe, considering his words. "When I was in the army, we had this saying, yesterday's over, tomorrow ain't promised, today's all you got. Sounds simple, but it kept me sane through battles that should have killed me." He examined his work, then set down his tools. "You can't fix what's behind you, and you can't control what's ahead. Just do the work in front of you and trust it'll be enough." "That easy, huh?" "Didn't say it was easy. Said it was all you got." Ruth thought about that while she finished her rounds. About yesterday being over and tomorrow being uncertain, and today being the only thing she could actually affect. She'd spent 6 towns living in yesterday, haunted by failures and rejections, defined by what people had decided she was instead of what she could become. And she'd spent just as long fearing tomorrow, running before it could catch up with her. But out here on this drive, she'd learned to live in today, to focus on the work, to make decisions and stand by them and trust that doing her best was enough. Maybe that was what Mason had seen in her back in Salvation Creek. Not strength exactly, but the capacity for it, the willingness to stay in the hard moment instead of fleeing to easier ones. The crew rested through the second day. They needed it. Bodies needed time to recover from smoke inhalation and burns and the kind of fear that left you shaking hours later. Horses needed rest. Cattle needed rest. Ruth used the time to check her gear and repair what she could. Her bedroll was singed but usable. Her spare clothes were gone, burned, or lost in the chaos. She'd finished this drive with literally the clothes on her back and nothing else. Somehow, that felt appropriate. On their third day at the river, Mason called everyone together. "We move out tomorrow morning," he announced. 3 days to Fort Collins if the weather holds. The cattle are as recovered as they're going to get, and we can't afford to waste more time. "What's the plan if we hit another crisis?" Tom asked. "We deal with it." Mason's voice was flat. "Same as we've dealt with everything else on this cursed drive. We make decisions, we execute them, and we trust each other to do their parts." He looked around at the crew, at the men and one woman who'd survived storms and injury and fire together. "I want to say something," Mason continued. "When we started this drive, I knew it would be hard. I didn't know it would be this hard. I didn't know we'd face half the things we've faced. And I'll be honest, there were moments I thought we wouldn't make it." Henry shifted uncomfortably. The rest of the crew was silent. "But we did make it," Mason said. "We're still here, still moving, and that's because every single one of you refused to quit when quitting was the smart play." His eyes found Ruth's. "Some of you proved things on this drive, proved you belonged, proved you were tougher than anyone expected. And I want you to know I see that, I recognize it. And when we get to Fort Collins and sell this herd, every one of you is getting a bonus on top of your regular pay." A murmur of surprise ran through the group. "You earned it," Mason said simply. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow we finish this thing." He walked away, conversation over. The crew looked at each other with expressions ranging from shock to gratitude to exhaustion. "Well," Pete said, "didn't expect that." "Mason doesn't give compliments lightly," Henry said. He meant every word. Ruth felt something warm unfold in her chest. Recognition, respect, the knowledge that she'd done what she set out to do, and someone had noticed. That night, she couldn't sleep. Too much energy despite the exhaustion, too many thoughts racing through her head. She wandered to the edge of camp and found Mason standing watch, staring north toward Fort Collins. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Sleep's for people who aren't worried about their entire livelihood." Ruth stood beside him. The stars were bright without the smoke to obscure them, a blanket of light stretching horizon to horizon. "You really think we're going to make it?" she asked. "I know we are." Mason glanced at her. 3 more days, Callahan. Then you get that permanent job I promised. You still want it?" Did she? Ruth examined the question from all angles. A permanent job meant staying in one place, meant roots instead of drifting, meant becoming part of something instead of always being separate from it. It meant the opposite of everything she'd known for years. Yeah, she said. I want it. Mason nodded like he'd expected that answer. Good. Because I meant what I said earlier. You proved yourself. The crew knows it. I know it. Now you just have to know it. What if I mess up? What if I'm not as good as you think I am? Then you'll learn and do better next time. That's how this works. Mason turned to face her fully. You think I've never made mistakes? I've made dozens. Lost cattle, made bad calls, trusted the wrong people. But I learned, and I kept going. That's all anyone can do. Ruth thought about the pie and the dirt, about Jake Hollister's laughter, about 6 towns that had rejected her and one that might not. I'm going to keep going, she said. I know you are. Mason smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. That's why I hired you. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and the cattle sleep and the river flow north toward everything that waited for them. 3 more days. Ruth could do anything for 3 more days. They reached Fort Collins on day 38, 2 days ahead of Mason's revised schedule. The town appeared on the horizon like a promise. Buildings and streets and civilization after 40 days of nothing but grass and sky and cattle. Ruth had imagined this moment would feel triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow. Empty in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the knowledge that the hard part wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cattle sale went smoothly. Mason had connections with buyers who'd been waiting for this herd, and the price was fair considering the losses they'd taken. The crew got paid in a building that smelled like ink and old paper, cash counted out by a clerk who didn't look up from his ledger. Ruth stared at the money in her hands, more than she'd seen in years. Her share of the drive, plus the bonus Mason had promised. Enough to buy new clothes, a real bed for a night, food that didn't taste like dust. Enough to disappear if she wanted to. You coming back with us? Samuel asked. He was tucking his own pay into a worn wallet, his face split with a grin. Or are you planning to stay here and live it up? I'm coming back, Ruth said. Good. Would have been lonely without you. Samuel clapped her shoulder. First round's on me when we get home. You drink whiskey? I drink whatever's available. That's the right answer. The crew scattered into Fort Collins like seeds on the wind, desperate for baths and beds and women and whiskey. Mason gave them 2 days before they'd regroup for the journey back. 2 days to remember they were human instead of just cowboys. Ruth found a boarding house run by a woman who didn't ask questions and didn't care where Ruth came from. She paid for a room and a bath and stood in the tub until the water went cold, watching weeks of dirt and smoke and blood swirl down the drain. When she looked in the mirror afterward, a stranger stared back, thinner than before, harder. Skin bronzed by sun and scarred by rope burns and work, hair that had grown wild and tangled, eyes that had seen fire and death and survival. She looked like someone who belonged on the frontier, like someone who'd earned their place. Ruth bought new clothes from a general store, practical things that would survive ranch work, boots that actually fit, a hat to replace the one she'd lost in the fire. She kept the bandana she'd worn through the whole drive, smoke-stained and frayed. It felt wrong to throw it away. That evening, she found the crew at a saloon called the Dusty Rose. They'd claimed a corner table and were well into their second round when Ruth walked in. William saw her first and waved her over. There she is! Pete was drunk enough to be loud. The woman who saved my hand and Tom's worthless life. I'm sitting right here, Tom said, but he was grinning. Ruth slid into the empty chair they'd saved for her. Someone pushed a glass of whiskey into her hand. She drank it and felt the burn all the way down. To Ruth, Samuel raised his glass, who proved every single one of us wrong. I'll drink to that, Henry said. They toasted. Ruth felt her face get hot with something that might have been embarrassment or might have been belonging. She wasn't used to either. The night blurred into stories and laughter and the kind of camaraderie that only comes from surviving something terrible together. Tom told an exaggerated version of Ruth pulling him from the rocks. Pete showed off his healing hand to anyone who'd look. William got philosophical after his 4th drink and started talking about the nature of courage. It ain't about not being scared, he said, pointing at Ruth with his glass. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. That's what you did, every damn day. We all did, Ruth said. Yeah, but you had more to prove, more to lose if you failed. William drained his drink. And you didn't fail. That means something. It did mean something. Ruth just wasn't sure what yet. Mason appeared sometime after midnight, sober and serious in a room full of drunk cowboys. He found Ruth at the bar, nursing her third whiskey and watching the crew make fools of themselves. You ready for tomorrow? He asked. What's tomorrow? We head back. I've got business to handle at the ranch. Mason ordered coffee from the bartender. And we need to discuss your position. What you'll be doing, where you'll be staying, how this is going to work. Ruth's stomach twisted. She'd been avoiding thinking about the details, about what came after the drive ended and real life started again. Can we talk about it on the trail? She asked. We can talk about it now. Won't take long. Mason gestured to an empty table away from the noise. Ruth followed. They sat. Mason's coffee arrived and he wrapped his hands around it like the heat was necessary even in the warm saloon. The ranch is in trouble, he said without preamble. I told you that before we left. What I didn't tell you is how bad it is. I've got creditors breathing down my neck and a bank that's 2 payments away from foreclosing. This cattle sale helps, but it's not enough. I need to make changes. Ruth waited. She was good at waiting now. I'm cutting the crew down to essentials. Keeping Henry because he's been with me 20 years and knows the operation. Keeping you because you've proven you can handle anything. Keeping 2 others who are good with horses. Everyone else, Mason paused. Everyone else is getting paid and let go. What about Samuel, William, Pete? Pete can't work with that hand for at least 2 more months. William's getting older, and I can't afford to keep him on for light duty. Samuel's young. He'll find another outfit. Mason's jaw was tight. It's not personal. It's survival. Ruth thought about the crew scattered around this saloon. Men who'd become friends through fire and fear and 40 days of hell. Men who'd accepted her when acceptance seemed impossible. They don't know yet, she said. They'll know tomorrow. I'll tell them before we leave. Mason met her eyes. I'm telling you now because you need to decide if you still want this job, knowing that it means watching good men lose theirs. It was a test. Everything with Mason was a test. Ruth understood that now. I still want it, she said. Mason nodded like he'd expected that answer but needed to hear it anyway. Then let's get through tomorrow and we'll handle the rest when we're home. He left her with his untouched coffee and a weight in her chest that felt like guilt and necessity tangled together. The next morning came too soon and too bright. Ruth packed her few belongings and met the crew outside the boarding house. They looked rough, hungover and tired, but still riding high on the accomplishment of finishing the drive. Mason was already mounted, his face set in lines that Ruth now recognized as preparation for something unpleasant. Before we head out, he said, I need to talk to you all. The crew gathered. The morning air was cool and clear and completely wrong for what was about to happen. Mason told them, clean and quick like ripping off a bandage. The ranch was cutting crew, who was staying, who was going. No emotion, just facts delivered in that flat voice he used when he was trying not to feel. The silence after was worse than shouting would have been. Samuel was the first to speak. So that's it? We just did 40 days through hell and now we're done? You got paid, Mason said. You got your bonus. You did good work and I'm grateful for it. But I can't keep everyone. Why her? Tom pointed at Ruth. His face was red. No offense, Ruth, but why keep the woman who just joined over men who've been working cattle for years? Because she'll work for less and she's proven she can handle it, Mason said. Blunt, honest, cruel in its practicality. You want the real answer? That's it. I can't afford sentiment. William stood up from where he'd been sitting on his bedroll. His massive frame seemed diminished somehow, like the news had physically shrunk him. 20 years I've worked ranches, he said quietly, and it always ends the same way. You get old, you get slow, you become a liability. He looked at Mason. I understand. Don't mean I like it, but I understand. I can write you references, Mason offered. Good ones. You're a solid worker, William. Any ranch would be lucky to have you. Any ranch except this one. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mason's expression didn't change, but Ruth saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just exhaustion. Pete was next. My hand'll heal. I can work again in a month, maybe 6 weeks. I can't afford to pay you to heal. Mason's voice was still flat. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't pay my rent. Sorry doesn't feed my daughters. Pete's jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. You know what? Fine. I'll find something else. Won't be hard to find a boss who's less of a bastard. He stalked off. Samuel followed without another word. One by one, the rejected men drifted away, some angry, some resigned, all of them hurt in ways that wouldn't show up as bruises. Ruth stood frozen, watching it happen, watching friendships fracture under the weight of economics and necessity. She wanted to say something, wanted to apologize or defend or make it better somehow. But there was nothing to say. Mason had made a business decision, and she was on the right side of it. That was all. Henry and the two horse handlers who were staying, brothers named Jack and Cole, who Ruth barely knew, began preparing for the journey back. Ruth helped, grateful for something to do with her hands. William approached her while she was saddling Bess. "Ain't your fault," he said. "Doesn't feel that way." "Never does." William checked his own horse's girth. "But you earned that job. Don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't." Tom was right, though. You all have more experience. Experience don't mean much if you're not willing to use it. William's voice was gentle. You're willing. That's why Mason's keeping you. That and the fact that you'll work twice as hard for half the pay because you got something to prove. Ruth looked up at him. At this man who'd shown her kindness when he didn't have to, who'd taught her to sew and to survive and to exist in her own skin without apology. "What will you do?" she asked. "Find another ranch. Ain't hard for a man with skills." He smiled, sad and real. "Might head farther west. See what's out there past the mountains. Always wanted to see the ocean before I got too old." "You're not that old." "Tell that to my back." William offered his hand. "It was good working with you, Ruth Callahan. You're going to do fine at that ranch. Better than fine." Ruth shook his hand. His grip was firm and warm and final. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "Nothing to thank me for. Just treated you like crew, which is what you were." He mounted his horse. "You take care of yourself. And take care of Mason. He's harder than he looks, but he ain't made of stone. This is killing him, even if he won't show it." William rode off toward town to collect his final pay and whatever came next. Ruth watched him go and felt something crack in her chest. The journey back was nothing like the drive north. Just 5 of them now: Mason, Henry, Ruth, Jack, and Cole. The brothers were quiet types who kept to themselves and did their work without complaint. The dynamic was completely different. Smaller. More isolated. They made good time without cattle to slow them down. Mason pushed them hard, like he was trying to outrun his own decisions. They rode from dawn until well past dark, stopping only when the horses needed rest. Ruth spent the days lost in her own head, thinking about the crews scattered to the winds, about William heading west to see the ocean, about Samuel trying to find another outfit, about Pete going home to his daughters with less money than he'd hoped, and a hand that might never work quite right, about herself, still employed while better men weren't. On the 3rd night, Henry came to sit by her at the fire. The others were already asleep, exhausted from another brutal day of riding. "You're brooding," Henry said. "I'm thinking." "Same thing." He poked at the fire with a stick. "You feel guilty." It wasn't a question. "Shouldn't I?" Ruth asked. "Maybe. Probably. But guilt don't change anything. They're still gone, and you're still here." Henry looked at her with those ancient eyes. "Question is what you're going to do with it." "With the guilt? With the job? With the opportunity? With the fact that you got something most people don't, a second chance to build something that lasts?" He stirred the fire, sending sparks into the dark. "You can waste it feeling bad about the men who didn't get the same chance. Or you can honor them by being so damn good at this that Mason never regrets his choice." Ruth watched the flames eat the wood, consuming and transforming and leaving nothing but ash and heat. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "Sure you do. You've been doing it for 40 days. Henry stood, joints creaking. "Just keep being who you were on the drive, someone who doesn't quit, someone who solves problems, someone who shows up every day and does the work even when it's hard and thankless and nobody's watching." He left her with that advice and the dying fire and the weight of expectation. They reached Salvation Creek on day 6 of the return journey. Ruth saw the town in the distance and felt her stomach drop. She'd left here 43 days ago with nothing but anger and desperation and a job she might not survive. She was coming back with money and skills and a permanent position, but she was still the same woman who'd had a pie smashed in the dirt. The town hadn't changed. Same buildings, same people, same feeling of being slightly hostile to anyone who didn't fit the mold. Ruth rode in behind Mason with her head up and her shoulders back, refusing to shrink herself the way she used to. They stopped at the general store for supplies. Ruth stayed with the horses while Mason went inside. She was checking Bess's hooves when she heard a familiar voice. Well, look who came crawling back. Jake Hollister stood on the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his belt and a smirk on his face that Ruth wanted to slap off. Jake, she said flatly, heard you went on that cattle drive, heard you made it all the way to Fort Collins. He sauntered closer. Must have been desperate for help if Mason took you along. Ruth straightened up, looked Jake dead in the eye. I wasn't taken along. I was hired. I worked every day of that drive and I'm still working. Got a permanent job at the Hale Ranch now. Jake's smirk faltered. Doing what? Cleaning stalls? Whatever needs doing, which is more than you can say. Watch your mouth. Or what? Ruth stepped toward him. You'll smash another pie? You'll embarrass me in front of people who already don't respect you? You want to know the difference between then and now, Jake? He didn't answer. Then I cared what you thought, what this whole town thought. I let you make me small because I believed that's what I was. Ruth smiled, sharp and cold. Now I don't. I've been through storms and fire and drought. I've saved lives and earned respect and survived things you couldn't imagine. So your opinion? She made a dismissive gesture. Doesn't mean a damn thing to me anymore. Jake's face went red. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Mason emerged from the general store with a bag of supplies. He took in the scene. Ruth standing tall, Jake sputtering, and something like pride crossed his face. We done here, Callahan? He asked. Yes, sir. They mounted up and rode out. Ruth didn't look back, didn't need to. Jake Hollister and everything he represented was behind her now, shrinking in the distance like the town she used to drift through. The Hale Ranch appeared on the horizon at sunset. Ruth had seen it before, but this time it looked different. Not just a collection of buildings, but home. Or at least the promise of one. Mason led them into the main yard. A few ranch hands Ruth didn't recognize came out to help with the horses. The house itself looked tired, paint peeling, roof sagging in places, the whole structure leaning slightly like an old man who'd stood too long in one spot. It's not much, Mason said, following her gaze. But it's mine. For now, anyway. They unsaddled the horses and stored the gear. Henry disappeared into the bunkhouse. Jack and Cole headed to the stable to check on the horses that had been left behind. Mason stood in the yard looking at his ranch like he was seeing it for the first time. I need to show you something, he said to Ruth. She followed him to the main house. Inside was cleaner than she expected, but sparse. Furniture that was functional rather than comfortable. Walls bare except for a few faded photographs. The whole place feeling like nobody really lived there, so much as existed in it. Mason led her to a small office crammed with papers and ledgers. He pulled out a folder stuffed with documents. This is what we're up against, he said, spreading papers across the desk. Bills, debts, letters from the bank, numbers that made Ruth's eyes cross. I don't understand, she admitted. We owe more than we can pay. The cattle sale helps, but it's not enough. I've got 3 months before the bank forecloses. Mason's finger traced a line of numbers. Unless I can figure out how to increase revenue or decrease costs or both. Why are you showing me this? Because you're crew now, and crew deserves to know when the ship's sinking. Mason looked at her. I'm not giving up, but I need you to know what you're walking into. This job might only last 3 months. It might end with all of us losing everything. Ruth studied the papers, studied Mason's face, studied the question underneath all of this. Would she stay even knowing she might be building something that was already doomed? I'll stay, she said. You sure? I've got nowhere else to be. And you gave me a chance when nobody else would. Seems fair to return the favor. Mason nodded slowly. Then we better get to work. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of labor. Ruth threw herself into ranch work with the same intensity she'd brought to the cattle drive. She woke before dawn and worked past dark, learning the rhythms of the ranch and the 100 small tasks that kept it running. She mended fences and mucked stalls and helped with the horses. She learned to keep the books when Mason's eyes got too tired. She cooked meals when the cook they'd had quit because Mason couldn't afford to keep paying him. She did everything and anything that needed doing, never complaining, never stopping. Henry watched her with something like concern. "You're going to burn yourself out," he said one evening. "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping. You're barely eating. You're working like you got something to prove." "Maybe I do." "To who?" "Mason already hired you. The crew's gone. There's nobody left to impress." Henry sat down on the porch steps. "What are you running from now?" Ruth stopped what she was doing, oiling a saddle that didn't really need it. The question hit too close to something she didn't want to examine. "I'm not running," she said. "No? Then what do you call working yourself half to death on a ranch that might not exist in 3 months?" "I call it doing my job." "Your job don't require martyrdom." Henry's voice was gentle. "You earned your place here, Ruth. You don't have to keep earning it every day." But she did. She couldn't explain why, couldn't articulate the fear that if she stopped proving herself, even for a moment, it would all disappear. The job, the respect, the sense of belonging, all of it would evaporate like morning dew, and she'd be back to drifting. So she worked, and worked, and worked until her hands bled, and her body screamed, and exhaustion was the only thing that let her sleep at night. On a Tuesday in early autumn, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the ranch. He arrived in a polished carriage with 2 horses that probably cost more than Ruth made in a year. Mason met him in the yard, his face going carefully blank in that way that meant trouble. Ruth watched from the barn, close enough to hear but far enough to pretend she wasn't eavesdropping. "Mr. Hale," the suited man said, "I'm David Porter, representing the Western Cattle Company. We've been reviewing properties in the area, and yours has come to our attention." "Has it now?" "We'd like to make you an offer. A generous one." Porter pulled papers from his leather case. "We're prepared to purchase your land and livestock for a sum that would clear all your debts with the bank and leave you with a comfortable retirement." Mason didn't move. "And what would the Western Cattle Company do with my ranch?" "Consolidate it with our other holdings in the region. We're building an operation that can supply the entire eastern market. Your land would be a valuable addition. In other words, you'd strip it for parts, and I'd be out. You'd be compensated fairly." "I didn't ask about compensation. I asked what would happen to the ranch my father built." Mason's voice was cold. "And you just told me. So the answer's no." Porter's smile didn't waver. "Mr. Hale, I understand this is an emotional decision, but the reality is that you're 3 months from foreclosure. We're offering you a way out with your dignity intact." "How do you know about my finances?" "We make it our business to know." Porter tucked his papers away. "Think about it. We'll give you 2 weeks to consider. After that, the offer expires and you'll have to deal with the bank on your own." He left in his fancy carriage. Mason stood in the yard, hands clenched, jaw tight with the kind of anger that had nowhere to go. Ruth approached carefully. "What are you going to do?" "Not sell." Mason's voice was rough. "I don't care what they're offering. I'm not handing this place over to a corporation that'll turn it into just another number on a ledger. Even if it means losing everything. Even then," he looked at her, "you think I'm being stubborn. I think you're being loyal to something that might not deserve it." Mason almost smiled. "Maybe, but it's all I got. This ranch, this land, it's my father's legacy. I can't just sell it off because things got hard." Ruth understood. She didn't agree, necessarily, but she understood. Sometimes you held on to things past the point of logic because letting go felt like admitting defeat. That night, she couldn't sleep. Again. She lay in her bunk in the small room Mason had given her, actual walls and a door, better than she'd had in years, and stared at the ceiling. The ranch was dying. Mason was too proud or too stubborn to save it, and Ruth was tied to its fate now, whether she wanted to be or not. She thought about the Western Cattle Company, about David Porter's expensive suit and easy smile and the offer he'd made, about the 2 weeks Mason had to reconsider, about the files in Mason's office with all their damning numbers. An idea started forming, dangerous and probably stupid, but an idea nonetheless. Ruth got out of bed and went to the office. She lit a lamp and pulled out the ledgers, studying them properly for the first time, looking for something specific, a pattern, a mistake, anything that might give them leverage or options or hope. She found it 3 hours later, buried in correspondence from 6 months ago. A letter from the bank detailing the terms of Mason's loans. Another letter from a lawyer Mason had consulted. A third from the land office about property boundaries. There was something wrong with the numbers, a discrepancy in what the bank claimed Mason owed versus what the original loan documents stated. Not huge, maybe $5,000, but significant. Either the bank had made an error or they were deliberately inflating the debt. Ruth's hands started shaking. This could be nothing, a simple accounting mistake that would be easily explained, or it could be evidence of something worse, something that might give Mason a fighting chance. She gathered the documents and waited for dawn. Mason found Ruth in his office at dawn, surrounded by papers and looking like she'd been awake all night, which she had. "What are you doing?" he asked. Ruth looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp. "Finding you a way to save this ranch." She spread the documents across the desk, pointing out the discrepancies she'd found. The original loan amount versus what the bank was claiming. The interest calculations that didn't match. The payments Mason had made that seemed to have disappeared into thin air. "This doesn't make sense," Mason said, leaning over the papers. "I've been paying them for 3 years." "Exactly. But according to these records, the bank is counting your debt like you haven't made half those payments." Ruth pulled out another document. "And look at this. The Western Cattle Company. They bought the bank 6 months ago, right around the time your payment records stopped matching up." Mason went very still. "You think they're inflating my debt to force me into foreclosure?" "I think it's convenient that a company wanting to buy your land now owns the bank holding your loans." Ruth met his eyes. "And I think we can prove it if we get the right lawyer to look at this. Lawyers cost money I don't have. Then we find one who works on contingency, or we go to the land office and file a complaint, or we take this to a newspaper." Ruth's voice was rising, fueled by too much coffee and not enough sleep, and the fierce certainty that she was right. "We do something, Mason, because if they're doing this to you, they're probably doing it to other ranchers too." Mason stared at the papers like they were a map to somewhere he'd given up on reaching. Hope was dangerous. It made you believe in things that could break you when they fell apart. "Why?" he asked. "Why spend all night digging through my finances? Why care this much?" Ruth didn't have to think about the answer. "Because you gave me a chance when I had nothing. Because this ranch is the first place that's felt like home in 6 years. Because watching someone take it from you through lies and manipulation makes me so angry I can't see straight." She took a breath. "And because I'm tired of watching good people lose to bastards who think money makes them untouchable." Something shifted in Mason's expression. The hardness softened just slightly, enough to let through a glimpse of the exhaustion and fear he'd been carrying alone. "All right," he said, "let's fight." They rode into town that morning with the documents in Mason's saddlebag and a plan that was more hope than strategy. The lawyer's office was above the barbershop, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under their boots. Thomas Brennan was younger than Ruth expected, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that were too sharp for his soft face. He listened to their story without interrupting, examining the documents Mason laid out. "This is fraud," he said finally. "Clear as day. The Western Cattle Company is inflating debts to force foreclosures, then buying the land cheap and consolidating it into their empire." "Can you prove it?" Mason asked. "With these documents?" "Maybe. But we'd need more than just your records. We'd need to show a pattern." Brennan tapped the papers. "How many other ranchers are in similar situations?" "3 that I know of," Mason said. "All of them dealing with the same bank, all of them suddenly in worse financial trouble after Western Cattle bought it out." "Then we need their records too. We need to build a case that shows this isn't isolated, that it's a deliberate scheme." Brennan looked between them. "I'll take this on contingency. If we win, I get 30% of any damages. If we lose, you owe me nothing." "And how long will this take?" Ruth asked. "Months, maybe a year if they drag it out." Brennan's expression was apologetic. "Legal battles move slow." "We don't have months," Mason said. "We have 2 weeks before Porter's offer expires and 3 months before the bank forecloses." "Then we buy time." Brennan was already making notes. I'll file an injunction to halt foreclosure proceedings pending investigation of the debt discrepancies. It won't stop Western Cattle from making their offer, but it'll keep the bank from taking your land while we build the case. It wasn't a solution, but it was a chance. They left the lawyer's office with something that felt dangerously like hope. Mason was quiet on the ride back, processing everything. Ruth let him think, content to watch the landscape roll past and feel the weight of what they'd started settling onto her shoulders. "You know they're going to come after us," Mason said eventually. "Western Cattle. They've got money and power, and no reason to play fair. Let them come." "You sound pretty confident for someone who's never fought a corporation before." Ruth thought about Jake Hollister and the pie in the dirt, about 6 towns that had tried to make her small, about 40 days of proving she could survive things that should have killed her. "I've been fighting my whole life," she said, "just never had anything worth fighting for before." The next 2 weeks were a study in controlled chaos. The injunction came through, halting the foreclosure temporarily. Western Cattle responded by sending David Porter back with a revised offer. More money, better terms, the kind of deal that would have been stupid to refuse under normal circumstances. Mason refused it anyway. Porter's smile finally cracked. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Hale. We're trying to be generous, but our patience has limits." "Then I guess we'll find out what happens when you run out of patience." Mason crossed his arms. "Now get off my property." Porter left, but the threats started arriving by mail. Legal warnings about what would happen if Mason interfered with Western Cattle's business interests. Suggestions that accidents happened on ranches all the time. Offers to buy out individual parcels of land at prices so low they were insulting. Ruth watched Mason burn each letter in the fireplace without reading past the first paragraph. "Doesn't it bother you?" she asked. "The threats?" "Threats only work if you're scared." Mason poked at the burning paper. "I'm too angry to be scared." "That's probably not healthy." "No, but it's effective." Meanwhile, Thomas Brennan was building his case. He'd contacted the other ranchers Mason mentioned and 2 more who'd come forward after hearing rumors. All of them had the same story: debt that didn't add up, payments that disappeared, and Western Cattle circling like vultures. "We've got them," Brennan said during one of their meetings. "The pattern's too clear to be coincidence. I'm filing a formal complaint with the territorial court and sending copies to every newspaper between here and Denver." "Will that help?" Ruth asked. "It'll make this public, and corporations hate bad publicity more than they hate losing money." Brennan smiled, sharp and satisfied. "They'll either settle or we'll take them to trial and destroy their reputation in the process." The story broke 3 weeks later. Front page of the Fort Collins Courier: Western Cattle Company accused of systematic fraud against local ranchers. Other papers picked it up. Suddenly, David Porter's expensive suits and smooth talk were being examined in print, dissected by reporters who smelled blood in the water. Western Cattle denied everything, of course, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that any discrepancies were simple clerical errors. But the court of public opinion was less forgiving than actual courts, and angry ranchers who'd been silent before started coming forward with their own stories. The fight dragged on through autumn and into winter. The ranch kept running on a combination of stubbornness and borrowed time. Ruth worked harder than ever, keeping the operation going while Mason dealt with lawyers and reporters and the grinding machinery of justice. Henry pulled her aside one evening after they'd finished feeding the horses. "You need to rest," he said. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that. Doesn't make it true." Henry's expression was stern. "You've been running on empty for months. Something's going to give. The ranch needs you healthy and sane, not worked to death." He softened slightly. "Mason's noticed too. He's worried about you." That surprised Ruth enough to pause. "He said that?" "Didn't have to. I've known him 20 years. I can read he's worried." Henry studied her face. "What are you so afraid of? You've earned your place here 10 times over. Nobody's going to take it away if you sleep a full night or take a day off." Ruth wanted to believe that, but years of drifting had taught her that security was an illusion, that everything good could disappear without warning, that the only thing you could count on was your own ability to survive when it all fell apart. "I can't stop," she said quietly. "If I stop, I'll remember I'm not supposed to be here." That this isn't mine to keep. Then stop trying to earn it and just accept it. Henry's voice was gentle. Your crew, Ruth, your family. That ain't something you have to keep paying for. But she didn't know how to accept things without earning them first. Didn't know how to trust that staying was allowed without constantly proving she deserved it. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Snow came early and stayed late, making work harder but also creating a forced slowdown. The cattle needed tending, but there was less to do, fewer emergencies, more time to just exist. Ruth found herself with idle hours for the first time in months. She didn't know what to do with them. Mason found her one afternoon in the barn, reorganizing tools that were already organized. You're doing it again, he said. Doing what? Making work where there isn't any. He leaned against the door frame. The tools don't need reorganizing. The tack was already mended. You're looking for reasons to keep moving. Ruth set down the hammer she'd been holding. I don't know how to stop. Then learn. Mason came closer. Listen, I know you're used to fighting for everything. I know you're used to nothing being permanent. But Ruth, you've been here 6 months now. You've saved this ranch more times than I can count. You've earned the right to just be here without constantly proving yourself. What if I don't know how? Then I'll teach you. Mason smiled, rare and real. Starting now. Put down the tools. We're going to the house. Henry's making dinner and you're going to sit at the table like a normal person and eat a meal without jumping up to do dishes or fix something or find another task. That's it? That's your big lesson in relaxation? It's a start. Mason headed for the door. Come on, before Henry burns whatever he's cooking. The dinner was simple. Stew and bread and coffee so strong it could strip paint. Ruth sat at the table with Mason and Henry and Jack and Cole, listening to their easy conversation about nothing important. The brothers were arguing about whether winter would break early or late. Henry was telling a story about a horse he'd trained 20 years ago. Mason was quiet but present, occasionally adding a comment or correction. Ruth felt herself relaxing despite everything. The warmth of the room, the food in her stomach, the casual acceptance of her presence at this table. Nobody was testing her or judging her or waiting for her to fail. She was just there. And that was enough. You all right? Mason asked quietly. Ruth realized she was crying, just a little, tears she didn't remember starting. Yeah, she said, wiping her face. I'm all right. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, it was true. The court case reached its conclusion in late February. Thomas Brennan called them into his office with an expression that could have meant anything. They settled, he said. Ruth's heart jumped. For how much? Full debt forgiveness for all the ranchers involved, return of any property already seized, and $100,000 in damages to be split among everyone who filed complaints. Brennan was trying not to grin. We won. Mason sat down heavily. Say that again. We won. Western Cattle doesn't want this going to trial, where all their dirty practices get aired in public. They're settling, paying out, and withdrawing from the region. Brennan pulled out the settlement papers. Your ranch is clear, Mason. No debt. You own it outright. The news hit Ruth like a physical thing. They'd won. After months of fighting and uncertainty and the constant threat of losing everything, they'd actually won. Mason was staring at the papers like they might disappear. This is real? As real as it gets. Sign here and the nightmare's over. Mason signed. His hand was shaking. They walked out of the lawyer's office into cold sunshine. Mason stood on the sidewalk, blinking like he'd forgotten what the world looked like without the weight of debt crushing him. We should celebrate, Ruth said. Yeah. Mason's voice was rough. Yeah, we should. They went to the Dusty Rose, the same saloon where the crew had celebrated finishing the drive. It felt like a lifetime ago. Ruth ordered whiskey and Mason ordered the same, and they sat at a corner table and tried to process what had just happened. I don't know what to do now, Mason admitted. I've been fighting for so long, I forgot what comes after. You rebuild. You make the ranch what it's supposed to be. Ruth raised her glass. You live. They drank to that. To living instead of just surviving. To having a future that wasn't defined by debt and fear and counting days until foreclosure. I'm making you a partner, Mason said suddenly. Ruth nearly choked on her whiskey. What? A partner, part owner of the ranch. Mason was looking at her with an intensity that made her nervous. You saved this place, Ruth. Your work, your discovery of the fraud, your refusal to quit when quitting was the smart choice. You earned more than a job. You earned a stake in what we're building. Mason, I can't. Why not? Because I'm. Ruth stopped. She'd been about to say she was nobody, that she didn't deserve it, that she was just a drifter who got lucky. But those weren't true anymore. Maybe they never had been. Because I don't know how to be someone who owns things, she said instead. I've spent my whole life with nothing. I don't know how to have something permanent. Then learn. Mason's voice was gentle. Same as you learned everything else, one day at a time. Ruth thought about it, about owning something, about putting down roots so deep they couldn't be pulled up by casual cruelty or bad luck or the kind of rejection she'd faced for years. All right, she said, I'll learn. They shook on it there in the saloon, the deal sealed with whiskey and handshakes and the understanding that they were building something that would last beyond them. Spring came slowly that year, winter reluctant to release its hold, but eventually the snow melted and the grass returned and the ranch came back to life. Mason used part of the settlement money to make repairs, fixing the roof, painting the buildings, replacing equipment that had been held together with hope and wire. Ruth threw herself into the work with a different energy now. Not desperate proving, but genuine investment. This was her ranch too, her home, her future. Henry noticed the change. You look happy, he said one morning while they were mending fence. Do I? Yeah. Settled. Like you finally figured out you belong here. He hammered a nail into place. Took you long enough. Ruth smiled. Some of us are slow learners. Some of us are stubborn as hell and refuse to believe good things can happen to them. Henry wiped sweat from his forehead. But you're learning. That's what matters. News of the settlement spread through Salvation Creek and beyond. The ranchers who'd been saved from foreclosure were grateful in their own gruff way, stopping by to shake Mason's hand, offering help with work, acknowledging what Ruth had done even if they didn't always know how to say it directly. Jake Hollister, predictably, had opinions. Ruth encountered him in town one afternoon while picking up supplies. He was leaning against the wall of the general store, looking like he'd been waiting for her. Heard you're part owner of the Hale Ranch now, he said. News travels fast. News travels when it's interesting, Jake pushed off the wall. You think that changes anything? You think that makes you somebody? Ruth looked at him, really looked. At this man who'd once made her feel worthless with a smirk and a smashed pie. Who'd represented everything she'd believed about herself, that she was less than, unwanted, destined to drift forever. He looked smaller now, or maybe she'd just grown. Yeah, Jake, she said, it does make me somebody. But not because of the ranch or the money or the title. It makes me somebody because I decided I was worth fighting for. And then I did the fighting. She walked past him into the store. He didn't follow. Later that week, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Ruth. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, half expecting more threats from Western cattle or some new crisis. Instead, it was from Samuel. The letter was short and full of his easy humor. He'd found work at a ranch in Wyoming. The pay was decent and the crew was all right, and he was saving up for that land he wanted to buy. He'd heard about the legal victory and wanted to congratulate her, wanted to know if she was doing all right, if the ranch was treating her well, if she'd learned to relax yet. Ruth read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of her desk, the desk in her room in the house Mason had given her space in, because the bunkhouse wasn't appropriate for a partner. She wrote back that night, told Samuel about the partnership, about the work they were doing, about how strange it felt to have a future she could plan for, asked about his ranch and his savings and whether he'd found anyone to share that future land with. It felt good to have a friend, to have someone who knew where she'd come from and cared where she was going. More letters followed. Samuel's replies were regular and warm. William wrote once from California, where he had indeed reached the ocean and was working at a ranch that raised horses for the army. Pete sent a brief note saying his hand had healed well enough to work again and his wife had given birth to a healthy son. Even Tom wrote, grudgingly admitting that Ruth had been right to save his life and wishing her well. The crew had scattered, but they hadn't disappeared. They were out there, living their lives, carrying the memory of 40 days that had changed all of them. Ruth kept their letters in her desk drawer, proof that she'd been part of something that mattered. Summer brought new challenges and new opportunities. Mason decided to expand the horse breeding operation, which meant more work but also more potential revenue. Ruth took to it naturally, her years of working with horses in various towns finally paying off in ways that mattered. They hired more hands, carefully this time, making sure they could afford to pay people properly. A young woman named Clara joined the crew, the first other woman Ruth had worked alongside in months. Clara was tough and capable and didn't take any nonsense from the men, which made Ruth like her immediately. "You're the one who did the cattle drive," Clara said on her first day. "I am." "Heard about that. Heard you saved some lives and survived a wildfire and became a partner." Clara grinned. "Also heard you used to drift from town to town getting kicked out everywhere you went." Ruth tensed. "That true too." "So what changed?" Clara's tone was curious rather than judgmental. "What made you stop running?" Ruth thought about that question. About pie in the dirt and Mason's offer, and 40 days of choosing to stay when everything hurt. About finding the fraud and fighting the corporation and learning that she was worth fighting for. "I got tired of being scared," she said finally, "and I found people worth being brave for." Clara nodded like that made perfect sense. Good answer. By autumn, the ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't in years. The debt was gone. The operation was expanding. The land that had nearly been taken was now secured for the future. Mason called Ruth into his office one evening. She found him staring at the same papers that had once shown their doom, now showing their success. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous." He smiled. "I'm getting older, Ruth. I'm tired. And this ranch, it needs someone with energy and vision to take it into the future." Ruth's stomach dropped. "You're not selling." "No, I'm stepping back, gradually." Mason looked at her. "I want you to take over day-to-day operations. I'll still be here, still help with big decisions. But the running of things, the planning, the future, that should be yours." "Mason, I don't." "You do. You've been doing it already, just without the title." He pushed the papers toward her. "This is your ranch as much as it's mine now. Probably more, if we're being honest. You saved it. You should run it." Ruth looked at the papers, at the numbers showing profit instead of loss, at the plans for expansion and improvement, at the future she'd helped build. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." "Then, yes." Ruth's voice was steady. "I'll do it." They shook hands again, sealing another deal that would change everything. That winter was different from the last. The ranch was secure. The work was meaningful. Ruth had a purpose that went beyond survival, and she had Mason. It started slowly, conversations that went longer than they needed to, touches that lingered, glances that carried weight. Neither of them acknowledged it at first. Both of them had been alone too long to trust what they were feeling. But one night in January, after a particularly long day of difficult work, Mason found Ruth in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "The mare?" "Any of it." Mason came closer. "The ranch, the work, the life. You don't have to do it alone anymore." Ruth understood what he wasn't saying, what he was offering. "I don't know how to be with someone," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust it." "Then we'll learn together." Mason's voice was soft, same as everything else. Ruth looked at this man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd seen strength in her when she couldn't see it herself, who'd fought beside her and trusted her and built something with her that was worth keeping. "All right," she said, "let's learn." He kissed her there in the barn with the mare watching and the smell of hay and horses surrounding them. It wasn't perfect. Neither of them knew quite what they were doing, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that was enough. Spring came again. The cycle continued, work and rest, planting and harvest, the endless rhythm of ranch life that Ruth had become part of. She stood in the yard one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over land she part-owned. Henry was in the stable. Clara was checking the horses. Mason was in the house making breakfast because he'd decided he enjoyed cooking now that he wasn't constantly stressed. Ruth thought about the woman who'd had a pie smashed in the dirt, who'd drifted through 6 towns believing she was worthless, who'd taken a job on a cattle drive because she had nothing left to lose. That woman was gone. Or maybe she was just buried under layers of experience and growth and the kind of strength that came from choosing to stay when everything screamed to run. Either way, Ruth wasn't her anymore. She was Ruth Callahan, partner and operator of the Hale Ranch. She was the woman who'd survived 40 days of hell and found home on the other side. She was someone who belonged, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. Mason appeared on the porch behind her, 2 plates of eggs and bacon in his hands. "Breakfast," he said. Ruth turned to him. This man she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back. This life she'd built from nothing but stubbornness and courage and the refusal to give up. "Coming," she said. She walked toward the house, toward the food and warmth and future waiting inside. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Everything she'd been running from was behind her. Everything she'd been running toward was right here. And she was finally, impossibly, home,